Emma Mosciardi for LAX Art. What is the strategy for the re-envisioning of a 40-year-old non-profit in this time and climate?
Well, I can only say, well, from my experience of arriving at White Columns 5 years ago, I was very aware of White Columns' history. I was very aware of its legacy. I was very aware of the moments in its history when it seemed to totally have its finger on the pulse, when it really seemed to coalesce what was happening in culture. But I was equally aware of the times when it wasn't. And I think, these kind of ebbs and flows are probably essential to any kind of organization. You can't sustain a kind of sort of persistent kind of level of activity. And I think there's a kind of exhaustion built into running a small organization that affects everybody that works there. But I certainly felt that New York's quite particular. If you live there or if you've spent time there, I'm the first director of White Columns that's not American. I'm the first director of White Columns that has no historical engagement with New York City. And I also felt that when I arrived there 5 years ago, the economy was in very good shape. The art economy was obviously beginning to get out of control. And it seemed to be a paradoxical time to be thinking about a small not-for-profit kinds of spaces. But for me, it seemed an absolutely perfect time to look at this kind of structures again. And I wasn't alone in thinking about this. Deborah Singer left the Whitney to run the Kitchen. Abe Ronson, very established artist, went to Rehelm, Printed Matter, and others. Curators actually had substantially more experience than historically would have been necessary for the job. Made a decision to leave larger institutional structures and work in smaller institutional structures. And I think the reason was that what happened with larger institutions was that you got slowly further and further away from the core activity, which is working with artists. So I think there was a desire to get back to working with artists. And for me at least, White Columns just seemed like a perfectly open spot. And certainly in New York, there's a very large commercial art market. There's a very large institutional world. But in the middle of that, it's a huge space. And for me, it was a very interesting space to really start thinking about again. And I think in the most simple way, the reimagination was really to just change the kind of content and change the kind of ownership of that content. And a way to do that was just to bring in, as much material as possible. In the last 4.5 years, I think we've organized 180 shows. We've worked with over 500 artists. We started to change radically the kind of artists White Columns was working with. In the past, it had been very historically associated with working with artists right at the beginning of their career. So very nascent practices. Obviously, we're still interested in that. But we started to work with much more older, senior artists who, for one reason or another, work had somehow escaped notice or attention. But then also we started to work with the community of mentally disabled artists in California, which is now a 5-year conversation of White Columns and a 10-year conversation for me personally. And then we started to work nationally. And I think we have limited resources, so we just couldn't start working internationally. But certainly in my travels in the United States, every time I went to a different city, wherever it was, Milwaukee, Portland, Oregon, who knows, I'd always find these amazing communities of artists doing amazing things. And I think New York, perhaps rightfully, has a kind of arrogance that it assumes eventually everything will come to it. And, for me it was obvious that we could speed up those conversations. And the goal really was to create an organic network amongst artists working elsewhere that was sustainable. So that it wasn't just to do a show with an artist and then move on, but it was to keep an ongoing conversation with communities of artists. So we've established, I think, quite substantial conversations with artists working in Milwaukee, Winnipeg, and elsewhere. And just to kind of just keep it going. So the idea that you've worked with someone and then you move on is not of interest to me. It's kind of like a lifetime commitment. But certainly I think this overproduction of exhibitions and this kind of working with so many people, I think it just changed just the dynamic of the organization. It forced us to work much quicker. But it just changed the conversation. And for me personally, it's been a very interesting process.